So we are live. Welcome, everyone. Tonight will be a special Wednesday. This is not From the Ground Up podcast, but I am going to make a special announcement. I have something really fun to tell you guys all about. So I'm going to bring on my friend Dominique DiFalco to tell you a little bit more about what's going on.
Hey, Joe.
What's up?
Thank you. It's like funny because we've been chatting for 10 minutes and you have to pretend like we just started talking to each other.
I know, right?
Well, hi, everyone. I'm not sure who's listening, but if you don't know me, my name is Dominique DeFalco. I am a friend of Joe's here, and we are excited to announce that we're starting a new podcast. So Joe has been incredibly helpful, and under the Port City Pet umbrella, I guess.
Yeah, maybe should I be a network now? What do I do now? I don't know.
I mean, that's more your decision. You're the CEO.
The CEO. You're making it out to be something a lot more than it is.
I'm just the assistant.
I'm a guy with a computer and a microphone, and you're
yeah. And you sent me a microphone that literally didn't work. So we're already a week behind schedule.
All right, that's a whole different story. All right, no one needs to know. Sorry, I failed in my CEO duties there, and I gave you a faulty microphone. So maybe this would have been happening sooner if it wasn't for that.
Yeah, but better late than never, right?
There you go. So what is your podcast going to be called? What is it all about?
So we are starting what's called the Modern Medusa podcast. I am going to be hosting and hopefully going to be having guests fairly regularly focused on highlighting female herpers, reptile keepers, and then also non-binary keepers. Because we've just noticed there's a bit of a lack of representation there for women in herping on more of the podcasts. So having one solid platform to really highlight these awesome women doing some really cool things with reptiles would be really fun.
Yeah, I think we had a conversation maybe after a few beers over Instagram chat. And I think you were like, there's no women-led podcast, and there's not really many podcasts that highlight women. I mean, obviously, I've had women on my show, like Justin's had women on his show, NPR, all them guys. But really, like, a really small percentage, right? Because A, the snake community is largely male in a lot of places, and B, the fact is that all the podcast hosts are male. So then you're like, someone needs to do this. Then I'm like, why aren't you doing this? And you're like the perfect person to do it because because
I'm loud.
you are very you're very good at connecting with people. You're very good at like making community, and therefore you made the women's group on Facebook, right?
Yeah. So a lot of this was started by about 7 months ago now. In June, I started the Female Herpers and Reptile Keepers Facebook group, which is another reptile group specifically focused on bringing together women and non-binary people in the hobby. And this is going to be, it's a really nice place for people to ask questions that they wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable asking other places without a lot of the judgment or drama associated with other groups. So ironically, about 3 weeks ago, there was a message that was put out there asking to see what podcasts had female guests on it. And this is already when we had planned on starting this podcast, and we hadn't announced it to anyone yet. So I was like, oh shit, like, I guess people do want this. So we decided, really got the ball rolling there. But looking at the most popular reptile podcasts out there, there are women being represented on these podcasts, but a lot of times the guests kind of cycle through the different shows. And so when there's not a lot of women on one podcast, they don't have a tendency to get to the others. So having a primarily female-focused podcast was definitely a need. And, there's 1,300 people in my group, so that's a few years worth of episodes, I think, right there.
Yeah, I think you sent me a list, and I was like,
yeah.
Whoa.
I think I had like 48 people that I wanted to interview after our couple beers over FaceTime where we decided to do this.
Yeah, we were like one toe in and you already had a list of 48 people, which is why you have such a better brain for such a more strict kind of organized podcast in which I think And I've already gotten a glimpse, obviously, of what you recorded, right? I am the CEO after all.
You are the CEO.
And it's just so laid out and so much better than my brain could do it. So like your podcast, at least so far, has been something that like I would like to listen to. I don't necessarily like the types of podcasts that I make, very conversational and stuff like that. But like, so I appreciate it. So I think anyone who listens, to my podcast, it's going to be completely different and it's going to be better because I'm all willy-nilly.
And I definitely am really excited to have kind of those conversations but they come from a different angle, and they're going to be with some people who you haven't necessarily heard from before because they haven't had the platform before. And then also we have an intro episode that will hopefully be coming out tomorrow morning. One thing I'm also really passionate about is highlighting women in the hobby and women in herpetology as a whole who have kind of forged the pathways for everyone to keep snakes and keep reptiles. So focusing on doing some like biographical podcasts talking about specific herpetologists and female herp keepers and really delving deep into that. We'll hopefully get a nice little variance between the different types of podcasts we're doing.
Yeah, and I cracked up at the end of the one, you pretty much put a short bio at the end of your intro. And it was like, yeah, well, like 19 snakes escaped, and she wasn't very responsible.
I mean, I did make a disclaimer that the first person we're highlighting wasn't necessarily the best, but some mistakes doesn't discount all the great things she did for the hobby and for women as a whole. So we have to take the good with the bad when it comes to that.
Yeah, I think it was a different era of herp keeping.
Yeah. Well, and you know how the story ends, so it wasn't. It obviously she learned her lesson.
Oh, yep. So aside from that, I mean, people are already asking, are you gonna do a live show eventually? Are you gonna do something video based? I know we're gonna release audio tomorrow, but the plans moving forward.
I think doing a live show would definitely be something I'm interested in doing in the future. For the first few episodes, I think we're going to try to bank a few, get kind of the flow of how the interviews are going to go and what the focus is really going to be, and hopefully transition to live in the future. But it's also going to depend on how my hair looks that day. So we just have to, play it by ear.
Respectable. So do you have any idea of what kind of guests? I mean, obviously you're looking at females, but is this a ball python podcast? Is this a corn snake podcast? What's going on?
It's all of the above. So I'm actually really excited. So our first guest we're recording on Friday. She's actually a really phenomenal venomous keeper and also just an educator in general who has managed to make a whole career out of reptiles, which is really exciting. So we're going to hit the ball rolling with some really badass women. And then I'd love to speak with basically anyone who touches herps or animals in any regard. I'm also going to stop saying as much. I promise I'll grow out of that. But
I'm still trying myself. So
yeah, while we have a big focus on reptiles, I also want to highlight women in general who work with animals, because animal keeping as a whole, outside of reptiles, is primarily female dominated, with zookeeping, running rescues and sanctuaries and stuff. So I have some cool people lined up who work with reptiles, but also potentially mammals and other species too.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's something that not too often do I get out the scope of like reptiles, but yeah, I realized that the whole rest of that area is a lot of females, especially when you're looking at mammals and stuff like that, which I mean, it's obvious, right? But then again, I didn't think about it. But so yeah, I'm pumped just to hear about other animals, not just snakes and stuff like that. So talk a little bit about yourself. I mean, for people who haven't seen podcasts that we've done together, with a little bit of background to what you do.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, like I said, my name is Dominique DiFalco. I have DiFalco Reptiles. I primarily got into the hobby with green tree pythons, which are my definite passion. I love Morelia as a whole, but I also keep a small collection of ball pythons. I have a few Bredl's pythons and just a few miscellaneous species. I got into the hobby about 3.5 years ago, starting working with a local reptile rescue. So my first launch into the hobby was really working with animals that had been abandoned or were from bad situations and helping with rehabilitation and rehoming. And then I started my own collection about 2 years ago. And I just graduated from University of Cincinnati with a degree in information systems. So with an IT background, I'm very familiar with working with a lot of men and being a minority in that regard. And one of the things that I absolutely loved while being in university were these awesome groups for women to connect with each other and have conversations that they couldn't necessarily have when they were so outnumbered by men. And I noticed that that was really prevalent in the reptile keeping hobby as well. So I kind of took a lot of what I was seeing at school and was like, okay, well, I graduated, but I don't know how to identify besides being a student. So let's just pretend we're still that and continue with what I know best. So building the women's reptile group and starting making all these connections.
So how do you, I mean, what gives you kind of the gumption to do it in the first place, to get out and talk to people and connect with people? Because I'm sure there's plenty of people who are here who may be nervous and are trying to find kind of their group within the reptile hobby.
Yeah, so I think finding some phenomenal friends to begin with was one of the most important parts, and finding people who supported me even when I said dumb things, like you, Joe.
We all say dumb things.
Because I say dumb things on occasion, and if I have a podcast, I think people are going to realize that. But finding people who pushed me when I had kind of a crazy idea for like starting a women's group. So Jacob Bratz was a huge supporter for me, and he's like, yeah, start the women's group. If it flops, it flops. Like, that's fine. No one's going to care. And then, so that took off. And then continuing to create a larger Modman team on that group and continuing to grow to over 1,300 members in 6 months. And then, you know, the crazy idea, like, well, what if I started a podcast? And you're like, okay, we'll do it. And just pushing me to do it. So, you know, find your group and things will come. And if you don't have that group yet, like, reach out to me. I'm always looking for new friends. And I think at the end of the day, everyone's here to support each other and continue to progress the hobby as a whole. So don't be too intimidated.
Yeah, 100%. And I think as long as you're interested in whatever's going on, or even your own thing, I think our friend group, we have a sphere of people who are all doing, they're at least all hardworking, very interested in herps themselves, individuals. But there's not much else like holding us together. We don't even like the same species, you know, generally. None of that.
We don't even like the same jelly beans. We had an argument about that in the group chat tonight.
and I like circus peanuts and candy corn, and not everyone.
Oh God.
So it's like, yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be someone who's exactly like you as far as what you keep. But then again, like people who are out there putting themselves out there, doing things in the hobby that are contributing positively. Then, I mean, when you're around those people, you just kind of join them eventually, whether you like it or not. Because if you ask your friends, like at home, I'm going to start a podcast, they're going to ask you like questions like, are you really sure? Like, what is going on with that? Do you really want to do this? But we're going to be like, hell yeah, because it's like some of us have podcasts like that. Like, of course.
Yeah, we have a lot of friends with podcasts. I think we're all like closet narcissists, like to hear ourselves talk. That's okay. We can admit it.
I mean, some of us like to hear ourselves talk and not on video. So are we complete narcissists?
That's true. That's true.
Remains to be seen. I don't know. I'm not a doctor.
You're just a CEO.
And yes, my mom is happy because she's the one who got me into circus peanuts, and of course she's watching.
All right. Well, I won't make any rude comments about your mom then, but
not in front of my mother.
I'm so sorry.
So as far as podcast wise and stuff like that, what kind of got you into podcast? Because obviously I don't know where you found me. Was it YouTube or podcast first?
We don't
have to go through the whole story, right?
Yeah, well, the embarrassing Facebook posts that have come up like every year in my memories. It's like, Joe Phelan's so cool. Like, I want to be like him one day. And I'm like, oh, barf.
No.
When I was just finding your podcast, so I found a YouTube video you put out like a few years ago about limeade, your green tree, and I was like, I want that. And then you were like, listen to my podcast, and I had a super long commute because I was living in Seattle. I think I was commuting like an hour and a half either way.
Wait, you live in Seattle? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I did 2 internships out there. I'm much more interesting than I appear. I promise. That's why I want a podcast. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I listened to your podcast, and then started listening to Herpetologists podcasts, and kind of got on the train of all of those. And I think it's such a great platform, and it's so accessible for people. Especially, I work in an office, 40 hours a week at my desk. That's when I consume most of my podcasts, while I'm plugging away on some marketing work. So it's a great platform, and it's a really personable way to do media outside of like a traditional YouTube video or a traditional like radio show, I guess, because you can kind of have it both ways.
Yeah, and I think I was trying to get at the fact that you didn't just start a podcast because everyone's starting a podcast. Like you listen to podcasts, like what a podcast is. So it's not a very far-fetched idea once you get down to it. And it seems as though everyone acts like starting a podcast out of the blue, but most of them have already been listening to podcasts for years and years. And I think probably part of you probably wanted to do a podcast sooner than you wanted to admit to yourself that you want to do a podcast.
I mean, yeah, you don't have to put me on blast there, Joe. But yeah, I mean, I definitely wanted to do a podcast, but there was a lot of worry and feeling like I wasn't qualified enough to do it. And then I remembered you have a podcast, and I was like, I'm obviously qualified enough to do it. So no, I was worried a lot. Kind of going back to having a good support network, I was worried that people wouldn't necessarily take me seriously, especially with such a specific type of podcast we want to be doing. So, but I think just getting the support and recording the first intro episode, it's 10 minutes long, and I think it took me 4 hours because I was so nervous. But I feel a lot better, and I'm really excited about what we're doing, and I think it's such an important part of the hobby to be highlighting, and I'm just so honored that I can be the person to help do that.
Yeah, and I'm so honored to be able to just facilitate it,
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that it's not like you're doing all the work. Like that first podcast, like you said, took you 4 hours, and it sounds perfect. So, and I appreciate
that. There's the ambulance in the background because I live across from a hospital, and I recorded it on a Friday night downtown across from a hospital. There's an ambulance every 2 minutes.
I think that's kind of the beauty of a podcast, in which the ambient noise or breaking of that third wall is just kind of accepted, and it reminds you that at the end of the day, we're all just people with microphones in our house. We're not in a studio somewhere doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your future plans as far as media and stuff like that with the podcast? Do you plan on doing anything else anytime soon?
So the one thing that I would really like to do is I am working on a website to help get a good hub for women in the hobby, and to highlight other podcasts that have had female representation and such. And ideally, I'd love to have just a place to be like, okay, you want to buy a crested gecko? Well, here's a list of female keepers or female breeders if you would like to do it. That's a first step, as opposed to generally a morph market or something. So the website's coming along slowly but surely. It's really fun to be doing it, but I can't guarantee it's going to come out anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think that it seems to be there's some areas that are more concentrated with female keepers and breeders. And I think you mentioned crested geckos, I feel is dominated by a lot of female keepers and breeders, as well as even when I'm in corn snakes. I mean, I feel the majority are females.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation to have with those who keep those species or similar species, because I don't have either species, and I never was extremely interested in either. It just wasn't where my interest lied. But I think that's a great conversation to have and like ask what was it that brought you into this species? Is it, that there were color opportunities? Is it that it was already female dominated and that way you felt more comfortable in the space? And having those conversations with people is going to be really exciting.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, especially getting into, I feel like you got into maybe the most kind of testosterone field, unless it's
besides hots. Yeah, besides hots.
Oh yeah, I'm kidding. There's a lot of levels to this game. There's retics, there's berms, there's hots. Ball pythons, I'm not sure where they fall. Somewhere in the middle of all of that. But yeah, green tree pythons.
But I think, I've said it once and I'll say it again. I think while Morelia in general and green tree pythons specifically are very male dominated, they've always been extremely welcoming. It's never been a place where I felt that macho sense where you might see in a couple of the other species. It's been just such a supportive space for everyone because everyone cares about the snakes first, especially when it comes to green trees. It's all about the animal you have rather than who is behind the account that's running it.
Yeah, maybe a little bit too much at times where like everyone's very nitpicky about how you keep your animals, which is understandable. And everyone
I can't comment on that.
But then again, you don't see many green tree guys with their shirts off posing with their snakes either. So
yeah, well, we're not supposed to touch our snakes. That's like what we're told.
Yeah,
if you have green trees, I always just say it's a really expensive fish tank.
Yeah, you don't hold a stick on both ends with a snake in the middle shirtless. So that's
I mean, but maybe that's a market that we can corner.
There you go.
That could be. We'll do a magazine or a calendar.
Calendar. Oh my God! What if you did like a very? What's the reverse of misogynistic? What if you like
misandrist?
Is that what it's? Is that what
it's? That's the word.
Interesting. It's funny how little that happens that I don't even know that there's. But like, what if you did a bunch of half-naked dudes for the modern Medusa calendar?
I mean, if anyone wants to volunteer, I think
I volunteered. Justin and James, they're both in the chat.
Justin and James, okay, great. That sounds great.
And Cox.
Yeah, absolutely, Cox for sure. And you'll just be the photographer. You're the CEO. You don't have to get naked.
I mean, yeah, I got to put everything together. I need to, I could take the pictures, I guess, but I got to like call a printer or something, or I don't know. Maybe I'll make Casey do it. He's good at that, right?
Yeah, he's got a printing machine or printing press or whatever the hell.
Yeah,
and we'll get Billy with his Cricut to do all the t-shirts.
So, as far as females, I mean, who do you look up to in the hobby, or just in general as well?
So that's actually really interesting because I think that, I look up to a lot of women in the hobby, but the people that come to mind most for me are actually female herpetologists that I look up to. So Kristen Hecht, Kristen Hecht, who is a hellbender researcher. She is phenomenal. She's actually been like a really great mentor to me. I'm very active in the herpetologist Twitter community, ironically, even though I am not a herpetologist. I just like them. So I absolutely love what she's doing. And there's another herper on Twitter called Afro Herper, and she does like a Find That Lizard every week, which is her field work and she posts pictures of trying to get people involved in like observing landscapes, finding lizards, things like that. So I love that. And then as far as people in the hobby, I'm a little biased in saying this, but Carly Jones, I look up to her tremendously. She's a great friend of mine, and she's someone that is so passionate about advancing herpetological husbandry above advancing the amount of animals you have, which has been great. Pia Bartolini, like, how can you not look up to Pia? She's been a great friend as well. Meeting her after Daytona and helping her with some of the RPI social media stuff, I think I could go on for hours about the women that I admire in the hobby. And I think that's why we got to start a podcast so that everyone can be able to list, the top 10 women they admire in the hobby. I said it when I was on THP, but I want people to be able to list the top 10 female herpers they admire as much as the top 10 men, because I can name 10 guys that I look up to in a heartbeat, but to name the top 10 women is a lot harder. And I hope that one day we can make it so that it's just right off the bat for both.
Yeah, and I think the more, probably even since I've been in this hobby, there's just more and more people who are open to reptile keeping and breeding, but also just that brings more and more females who are comfortable with doing it also, as it becomes like out of the underground, out of like I went to a reptile show once in like the basement of a place. Like it was legit basement with like exposed ceilings and like fucking asbestos coming out of everywhere.
Cool.
It's not a very comfortable environment for most people. So I feel like just the welcoming and like professionalism also, and it isn't all guys with their shirts off holding a berm. It is some of that, but I mean, I just feel like it's hopefully more and more inviting to everyone now.
Yeah, and I think it's getting there, and I think having support from men in the hobby, prominent men in the hobby, I would consider you one of them, Joe, and having having people support the women in the hobby and giving us the platform to do these things is so important. And I think that makes people feel more comfortable to be a part of it. Because if I had said, hey, I want to start a podcast for women in the hobby, and you're like, oh, that's a dumb idea, I wouldn't have done it, but you were like, okay, let's try it. Let's do it and see how it goes. And that helps make the community so much more inclusive. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that is just, what year are we in? There's a,
oh God.
why doesn't this exist already? That's why I was like, wait a second. I didn't realize that there wasn't even a woman podcast host.
Yeah. And there's a few female podcast hosts, Desiree is on, I think it's the Underground. Oh gosh, I can't remember the name of that one. I'm sorry. And then there's Kiana, who does Canadian Herpetologists podcast. And then I know that James has had a few different female guests.
Well, he has his wife co-hosts as well.
Oh yeah, right.
I forgot. Exactly. There's a shit ton of co-hosts.
There's a ton of co-hosts, but there hasn't been a ton of like just focus on women and having those conversations with just women, because there's always been someone else there who doesn't necessarily understand the experience that we've gone through.
Yeah, I love that people in the comments are talking all about, why isn't there a man's only podcast or whatever? That's not really what we're talking about. Like, every other podcast is a man's podcast.
Yeah, like, I put together a list of all of the female guests on the major podcasts, and the least amount was 9 for like a show that's been running for years, and the most was like 17 for another show that's been running for years. And it's like, okay,
where am I?
I'm not going to say. People can look it up, but it's it's one of those things where you're like, okay, so they are having women on, but it's just few and far between. And I look at that and I'm like, okay, well, on the 40 some odd guests that I counted, I'm 3 of them. That's almost 10% of female guests. That's like not acceptable.
Well, you kind of hinted earlier that kind of once we have someone on, they're in the podcast space. So therefore other podcasts will have that individual on if they'd like their podcast with them. So I think a lot of time.
Great. So, but yeah, it does make a small circle.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times we kind of have the same people on, and especially because we listen to lots of Python-based podcasts, Morelia, and that kind of stuff. But then, you have communities like the Blood Python community, which was like one of their big pillars is a female, like Kara from Blood Cell, probably like the biggest influence in Pythons that aren't named Kevin McCurley and Barchek, probably, and not in ball pythons.
Yeah, there are phenomenal, amazing women in the hobby. I'm the first person to tell you that, but you shouldn't rack your brain to find them. You should be able to know them, and I think like we know some of them, but not all of them yet.
Well, once you put out 200 podcast episodes, you'll be one of them. No big deal.
Oh God. Is that the limit, 200? Is that when I know I've made
that's
it?
your first contract. You know that, right? You signed.
Shit, yeah. Am I getting paid?
Absolutely not. We'll talk later. We'll renegotiate after 100.
Perfect. Sounds great. I'll get another microphone that works.
All right. Don't get carried away. Come on. So obviously there's a lot going on here and a lot to think about in the future and to look forward to and all this stuff. Like, I don't think, because we didn't mention it, like, also, I don't know if there's not many podcast hosts who are like of our age range either. I think that's also a demographic in which is like, although there's a Gecko podcast with a kid who's like 18 and he's at it, which is awesome. But yeah, there's not too much younger blood up in here.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to pretend like I'm mature, but yeah, I'm like a glorified child. I can legally drink, but just barely. So.
Well, no, I think I must have been 23 or 24 when I started the podcast.
Yeah, which is where I'm sitting. So yeah, and I can.
And you're so much better than I was. It's ridiculous.
I just like to talk.
No, I was drinking beers and talking shit for.
I'll get more comfortable and we'll get to that point. So.
No, you're already matured past it. You're fancy.
Thank you.
So if anyone wants to go check out your podcast, check out everything that you got going on, where can they find you?
Yeah, so find me on Instagram and Facebook at DiFalco Reptiles. I would love anyone who has suggestions or is interested in being a guest. Please shoot me a message. Like I said, this is really new, and I'm looking to meet a lot more people. As far as the podcast itself, it's going to be called the Modern Medusa Podcast. I will be putting a little teaser of the first episode up on my Instagram later this evening, and you can listen to the first episode tomorrow on the Port City Pet RSS feed.
There you go. You just answered Justin's question in the chat right now.
There it is. I'm psychic.
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit before, like, hey, why not? Why have someone go and subscribe somewhere else? And yeah, so it's like, yeah, just stay tuned to your regular scheduled programming, and your podcast will pop up as mine slowly falls off the off the map.
Eventually, I will just become Joe.
Yeah, so then you will be CEO.
Perfect. That's the goal.
From this tall mountain that I sit upon.
Yeah.
Everyone.
I won't make a short joke. Don't worry.
All right, I didn't think about that. God. Anyway, anything else you have to share? Anything like that? Did you say your Instagram already?
Yeah, I did. Thanks for paying attention.
I'm reading comments. Give me a break here.
No, I mean, once again, I want to say thanks so much, Joe, for helping me out with this. I think it's going to be really exciting, and I'm so grateful for your mentorship and your friendship along this journey. So thanks again.
Awesome. I appreciate you coming along. Ryan Cox said the Port City Pet Radio Network hosted by Dominique DiFalco.
Yes, that's the goal.
Yeah, I really look forward to seeing what you do and listening to your podcast, because ultimately, as much as I like to give content to the people who are already listening, I also want to listen to a podcast myself in which that I don't know, I have a very, very small part in, but it's better than mine already, I swear.
Well, thanks, and just look out for our teaser episode coming out tomorrow.
Bam, you heard her. Port City. Pod
City Portcast.
Pork City Pod something. Yeah, so From the Ground Up podcast, RSS feed, Port City Pet, Port City Pythons. You know where to find me. Dom, we will catch you tomorrow.
So excited. Thank you, everyone.